Hey, this video is about sense making. The original introduction to the video got chopped up, and partly it was because the wobbliness in the camera was too intense. So I'm just pulling back now to not recreate the problem I'm trying to solve. I fixed it about 2 minutes into the video you're about to watch, but instead of asking you to watch the first 2 minutes, I was also a little rambly. I wanted to do this more proper introduction. Sense making is a big part of how I view the work that I do. And it is a term that I fear could be corrupted by people using it in some kind of doublespeak at some point. And it sounds like it sounds a bit Ministry of Truthish, but it's a practice that I think we need to be engaged in as humans alive on the planet in 2025. And in this video, I really just unpack some of my thinking around that. It's going to be a topic that we come back to on this channel, and one that we make conscious, how we're making meaning of things regularly. But this video is a longer talk, meant to sort of like just ease you into the notion of sense making, but also like point out some areas in our world where sense making would be valuable, as usual, all the way from sort of like the larger external threats that we're all conscious of in these challenging, polarized times, but also the internal, like how am I making sense of things? Because that's where it begins. So I give you today's video. So sense making, let me get back into it. Okay, so what is sense making? Sense making, probably the most accurate word we could use for sense making is meaning making. But we are drawing our meaning from somewhere. So I think sense making, it sounds better. And it reminds us that like our senses are what we're making meaning out of. That's the only thing we have in this external world to make meaning out of. And it raises the question of like inner senses versus exterior senses, or like senses that are a way of detecting what is happening in the exterior physical world. But of course, we also have inner wisdom, inner knowing, innate knowing, intuition to move in certain directions towards certain things, and to also move away from certain things, often for reasons we can't necessarily explain. So when we say sense making, what we're talking about is what I'm talking about, what I'm offering in this channel, what I see in the sense makers that I have learned from, whether or not they use that title. When I say sense making, what I mean is somebody who is making conscious, or the act of making conscious, if we're doing it together, we're making conscious all of the ways that we might make meaning of a situation, all of the different perspectives. So that's like my own perspective, but like part of sense making is actually trying to understand the perspectives of folks that I don't necessarily, who have perspectives that are distinctly different than mine. And to be fair, also trying to understand the perspectives of people who maybe have the same position as me in terms of preference for certain outcomes or decisions or choices that we might make as a whole. But who have arrived at that via different means. So sense making is really saying like, me as an individual separate self, I have access to my life history, my memory, or like an imperfect record of my life history. I've got all my past experiences. I've got all the books I've read. I got the news that I consumed this morning. And I'm in a location in the world. I'm, the youngest child in my family. I have all kinds of relationships within my family, within my community, within my neighborhood, with people that are varying degrees of conscious relationships, right? Like it takes two people to be in conscious relationship with one another, and two people to consciously engage in the act of making sense of their world and their lives together, or at least the part of their life that they share with one another. So all of that to say is like sense making is for people who recognize how imperfect a lens you are viewing reality through. Or I should say how incomplete a lens you are viewing reality through. There's actually quite a bit of work we can do to clarify our vision, and see more clearly and project less onto the situations in our lives that we are engaged in. There's all kinds of great work you can do when you find out you've projected a belief about reality that isn't real. Often that comes at a moment of like great personal anguish and frustration. But it's through having those personal experiences of grief, personal experiences of loss, personal experiences of realizing, I really did confuse the situation. Things were not at all like I expected them to be. There's not as many people who can step back and really be honest and reconcile about the untruths that rule their lives. But among those who can, one of the concerns that arises is a concern for the sense-making capacities of the whole. Because I think we all have it at this point. We all understand that the world is in an untenable situation, an impossible situation, that there's existential risk. Like there's a growing number of existential risks, ways the species could destroy ourselves. And, we can really sum that up as unregulated technological growth and expansion. The capacities to do great harm to the species are being democratized. So things like gene printer technology and CRISPR technology, not something I know a great deal about, but something that, if made accessible, puts powers of gods into hands of whoever can afford a desktop gene printer, which I hear is not a very far off point in the future. And anybody who looks at the whole and says, how is the whole doing? How is the planet doing? How are we progressing as a species? Anybody who sincerely asks that question, asks and wants to have information about, I think there's like two key sources, or two key questions, maybe a better way of saying it. One, like what are we striving towards? What is our vision? What do we understand our future to be? What's our future outlook? Like what is the future, the story of the future of humanity? And do we all know that story? Do we understand that story? And of course, the answer to that question is there's great disagreement. So another question, okay, so we don't pass that test. And we are on Spaceship Earth together. The other question we might ask is like, what are the things that are the greatest risks to us? And it's always more helpful to do a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threat analysis. We call them SWOT analysis in organizational development and management. But it's easiest to do a SWOT analysis if you know where you're going. But if one of the threats is that the whole thing, I'm laughing, but this is serious. Part of being able to envision a future is having a good sense that you have a chance at making it in the future. These are sort of like, if you've ever gone through like a dark period in your own life, it's like coming out of that dark period often is like, you get a taste of that a different future might be possible and you can dream a little more. You get a taste of that like a little different future might be possible and then you can dream a little more. That's how it's been for me and friends I've watched come through and rise through tough times. So as a species, there are just a lot of threats that could tank us. Just to name them, to get them in the space. And we talked about CRISPR technology and gene printing becoming democratized. Of course, the first real threat to our existence that arrived in humanity's timeline is still with us. Nuclear weapons are still at risk, and we can look at the political climate and see how things are going there. The likelihood that a weapon might be used sure seems to, back at the napkin math, sure seems to increase as we become a less stable climate, particularly in a more complex multipolar global conflict. And when I say multipolar, what I mean is there's not just a good guys and a bad guys. It's complex. It's confusing. There's different kinds of alliances that exist at the level of global politics and conflict. There's climate change. If you haven't thought of that as a threat, or you haven't imagined what life could be with a continued progression of global heating and climate change, it's not good. Like David Foster Wallace's book, The Uninhabitable Earth, paints a pretty bleak picture of the future of humanity should climate change continue to progress. And it's almost not worth mentioning because of how nuanced and complex this is going to be. Like, just naming it as a title, hopefully you have a kind of like an inner memory of like, this is why that could be a bad thing. But if you don't, I would encourage you to develop one. Encourage you to read that book and listen to some of the cautions, some of the likely risks we will encounter almost inevitably if the temperature on the planet rises. And he's just done an amazing job of making sense of that issue. So I named these as like, we need to be aware of these threats if we are going to talk about sense making really in any context, I would argue at this point. There's a tendency, I believe. So this is why I think sense making needs to become a greater part of the culture. And maybe it's a good time to just like give a good definition, understanding of what I mean by sense making. So we've been riffing on it so far, but let's get perhaps a little specific. Sense making. What is the problem sense making is solving? The problem sense making is solving is that we are one planet. We are one human species that covers the planet. And we might as well call ourselves the planet because we certainly have control over it in ways that no other species has had. We clearly have responsibility for it. No matter what your how you might envision humanity's place in the cosmos, at this moment in time, we are holding all of the levers of power for the future of this planet. We have a lot of control. Mother Earth will respond. Systems and patterns will respond in ways that make sense to the natural geology and climate systems and all of the other living systems on the planet. But right now, humanity is in the driver's seat of the planet, and we've reached planetary boundaries. So the argument for why we need to make sense-making more prolific is that like we do actually need to develop species-level understanding and species-level capacity to make sense of what's happening to our planet. And it is, I think the conflicts we are experiencing in the world today are evidence of the failure of our species to do that so far. But really, it's only that can protect us in the long term. It's only collective sense making that can protect us as a species and our planet in the long term if we're processing the signals that we're receiving in a truthful way. So when you think of sense making in terms of let's look at it like so the problem is we don't have a collective sense making apparatus that is functional, that allows us to make good, coherent choices at the individual level, but all the way up. Like, people don't know what to tell their kids right now about the future. Like, in a very apocalyptic way, like not in a, there's been lots of groups throughout history who've gone through hard times. This moment in global history is unlike any other, and we don't know how to make sense of it. There's a polluted information ecosystem. Our attention has been really corrupted as a species. And there's not a single group of people. It's not like there have been, like, some of us got burnt by the algorithms and our attention is fried. Most people have, or at least certainly most social groups. There are not many social groups or any that I know of that have a good grasp of what's happening in the affairs of the world, but also don't have like a significant portion of their membership like almost permanently wired into this technology in a way that it like makes it very difficult for us to collaborate together. So there's this sense that I have in my own life that like I go out into the world, and there's probably maybe 3 people that I'm in regular communication with who I genuinely feel like share a good degree of like sense making commonality. Like, sense making is a group project. So I'm putting these videos out there as sense making offerings, but it's a group project in the sense that like the essence of the reason why we need to do it is because one person's senses and exposure to the world isn't sufficient to develop a well-rounded enough position, a position that has a grasp of the scale and kind of complexity of how reality is. It's like one person is actually quite not a very good sense maker, but groups of people who don't have necessarily above average or even average intelligences, but who use sense-making processes can actually perform incredibly well when they're working in ways that allow their blind spots to become neutralized by the other intelligences in the groups, and allow their sort of like unique capacity to like sense in ways that others in the group don't, to shine and inform their group's awareness. Another thing to say about sense making is like, I think, as I mentioned, a lot of the people I follow do sense making, but don't call it sense making. So as I'm talking about this, like, I would encourage you to think of in your own excuse me, in your own contexts and life experience. Like, when have you experienced really good sense making in a group? And some of the things that I would sort of like look for as like reference situations, just to make sure you know what it is that I'm talking about when I say like a good sense making experience. Like, typically these are groups where a lot of time is spent on just like knowing the individual, not a crazy amount of time, but like there's a Check-ins is one of the processes that we use in the collaborative work that I've done in the past. Like good collaboration includes good sense making. Sort of like a check-in, which like often includes like a hello question, like how are you doing, so that the person can arrive in the group. And then like kind of a focusing question that's like, all right, the focus of this meeting today is we're going to talk about, we're going to reflect on, or we're going to plan something related to the next month's activities for maybe a group that we're all responsible for. And a check-in question would be like a warm check-in question would be like, what have you really enjoyed about what we're already doing, what we've already done? Like what have been some memorable or transformative experiences that you've had? These could be questions we ask to the whole group or group leadership. And like, what do you want more of? What do you want to see more of? Like, what are you craving in terms of programming? And then as you go about the meeting, it's like when conflict arises, instead of trying to sort of like get your way as leader or member of the group, like a group that is practicing sense making actually takes a minute and says like, oh, tell me more about how you feel this way, because I feel differently. And that's recognized as like, there's an opportunity for sense making and building there. And there's a part of us that wants to get our way, right? And actually that part, we can make that part like as members of the group, when someone's sort of like coming in and, you know, really trying to steer the conversation, saying things like, tell me more, asking them to elaborate on the position. We often don't do that kind of stuff by instinct in a lot of our meetings, because like, oh, now the chatty person is going to talk even more. And actually, if you draw them out and tell them that you're willing, this is the theory in deep democracy, is that if you draw someone out and encourage them to say what it is they're saying, and then maybe say it back to them, but a little stronger, like you have a more extreme position than they do. You say it, and then when you do, I mean, you can sense how it makes them feel to feel heard. It's typically pretty good. They're going to probably relax. And there's a moment where it's like they might actually think that you're on their side. And then you just turn to them and say, did I get it right? Another word for that is steel manning. So trying to understand a steel man, what a steel man is helpful if you understand what a straw man argument is. So a straw man argument is if you and I were in a debate, and I were to try and make a straw man argument of your position, I would almost like parodize it, like make fun of it a little bit and like make it sound stupid. So if I understand it, your position is that you think all farmers should just get subsidies, when it doesn't rain and they can't grow crops, and you don't like whatever. I would make it sound silly. And then I would tear it apart. But a steel man, if I'm steel manning your argument, I'm actually trying to make it as well or better than you are making your argument. And part of what that does is it relieves that person, if you're in the room with somebody, it relieves them of carrying the role, of carrying the responsibility of being the only one that has that piece of information in them, in their bodies. Their bodies can let go of it when they realize someone else. This is not an inappropriate way of thinking. I don't have to worry about that because this person just appropriated it. Literally took the words, put them in their mouth, said them back to me. Now I don't have to hold on to that anymore. That's how it works. There may be more, 100%, but once you've kind of like taken that burden off of somebody, like they don't have to carry, like that's a hard thing to carry when you're in a meeting and you've got to like push something out there, because it just feels like, if I'm not going to say it, who else is going to say it? It's not a good place to be. And I don't want, like, we shouldn't want people on our teams or in our meetings to feel that way, we should want them to feel relieved. And there's this belief, I was talking about this with a friend the other day. There's this belief out there that if I say words that I don't agree with, that like, I think some people actually think they will die. I'm not joking. I think there is that's the strength of the human ego, is that if I say, there's a belief at a certain stage of consciousness that if I acknowledge what you're saying, even just to parrot it back to you, even just to do the exercise of steel manning like I just described, there's a belief that doing so will lead to death. That's what the ego would like you to believe in that moment. And you don't die. So there's no like right way to sense make, is what I'm intuiting as someone who's tried, like I spent a lot of time trying to I was a data person for a long time. If there was a question that I wanted to have a good answer to, I went to the data. And data is one way of knowing. Like, it's an objective way of understanding reality, to the degree that objects are a sufficient way to describe reality, and what can be objectively proven is a helpful way of understanding reality. In particularly science education, if that's where you started, then there's a pretty good indoctrination into the objective truth. Repeatably verifiable truths are the ones that matter, or the only truth, perhaps. And they're good. It's not first person knowing. It's not. It's that's held up against in our, if we think of something like vaccines, for instance. There's that objective data. It's some of it is good. It's hard for us to know. It's hard for us to make sense of it because we know how corporate influenced it is. So there's a legitimate reason to question that, the data we're getting on vaccines, because a lot of the research comes from folks that have economic, financial interest in the widespread distribution of vaccines. And there's really specific ways where we can say that shouldn't influence, and it doesn't. And then there's all these seeping into the culture ways, or just there's all the untraceable ways that might happen, which you would know if you were in the industry. You would know if you read all the books that have been written about the corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. And we can want, as science lovers, we can want there to be good, pure data on something like vaccines that is perfect. That's not the world I see when I look out there. Part of good data means I would say the perception, people's perception around the trustability of that data is aligned with them making the right choice, right? We shouldn't collect data in an environment where there is no trust. We shouldn't expect that data to be trusted. So developing trust is part of sense making. Having the conditions in place that allow trust between parts, trust between parties, trust between people in their government, trust between people in the media outlets. It's as a channel creator, I'm conscious of those conditions. I'm conscious that I don't get to have an audience if I continually behave in ways that are neglectful of their trust. or that should lead someone to say, I don't trust him anymore. It's like I don't get to both collect truth and put it out there and say it's good, read this, watch this, consume this, and act in ways that are a betrayal of trust. One of which is making regular videos. So I understand right now, coming back, this is the second video I've made after like a 6-month gap. I get it. Nobody's watching. I understand that. I have to show up here enough times so that you trust that like this isn't going to be a channel you get used to following and get excited about, and then it disappears again. So we're doing sense making. The video is 35 minutes long. It does not feel like we have arrived at an end, so I will keep going. So the information ecosystem is polluted. That affects both our ability to consume the quality information that is out there. That is there is very, very valuable information out there. People have written books and articles and published videos on all kinds of topics in, I mean, all of history, but in the last, I guess, 4 years, like since COVID, there's valuable stuff out there that we don't have a direct pathway to accessing. And I mean, let me rephrase. It is simply beyond the capacity of a single individual in this system of algorithm controlled media consumption that most, if we ourselves aren't addicted to those algorithms and what they offer, many, if not most, of our peers are. So in that way, we've lost both our attention and, like, there were institutions before that we did trust, and whether or not they were trustworthy when we trusted them, there was a stability and a consensusness, a degree of consensus, let's say, that no longer exists. That consensus is broken down. And what it is revealing, I would suggest, I believe this, what it is revealing is that, I know this, what it is revealing is that we don't have a sufficiently common story to make consistent progress. We don't have a consistently shared story of what matters, of what is valuable. We don't have consistently a sufficiently broadly shared story that all of us can grasp onto as we sit down and plan our days, as we sit down and decide what to do with our time, as we sit down and try and plan a life, knowing the uncertainty in the global context. So there should be this, like, I think the natural thing to feel for a healthy, well-regulated individual right now, which is not most people, at least in the West. But the natural thing for a healthy, well-regulated individual at this moment should be some degree of disorientation. I think there's like once you've been accepting of the reality of the world, that sense of disorientation settles. And on the other side of the disorientation, we'd say the other side of complexity, the complexity of like just, I mean, Mark Gaffney calls this the second shock of existence. I'll describe what it is so I'm clear on what I mean. But the first shock of existence is our realization that we personally will die, that life in this body, life in that body isn't forever, that there is an end to our experience in this life. And that's the first shock of existence. Like, whoa, like maybe that happens via like a near miss car accident. Certainly that was how it happened for me. Maybe it happens with the death of a loved one, or just through contemplation. Like you get to the point where it's like health scare. That's another one. But the first shock of existence is like that realization as individual self that I will die, and the reckoning with it too. It's like you can kind of like sense that death is a thing, and like still not like actually go around the corner. But the second shock of existence is the collective experience of that we could actually lose all of it, that we could lose through something like catastrophic nuclear war, like all of humanity could disappear, or virtually all of it, all of us, or that we carry on as a biological species, but our humanity dies. So it's the death of humanity. The second shock of existence is the death of humanity, or the death of our humanity, like the unrecognizability of the human species, that instead of evolving into a higher form of species as every earlier form of hominid that we descended from did, instead of carrying on the tradition of our ancestors and evolving into a higher form of consciousness, a more loving human species, we regress and just become some species under technological control, or just as like doesn't resemble. I don't like. I mean, there's dystopic fiction books, you can read them. I don't think it's particularly helpful. 2025. You can also just look outside. But the reckoning with that, if you haven't reckoned with that, like absolutely go read some Margaret Atwood, some dystopic fiction. Go read David Wallace as well. David Wallace Wells' Uninhabitable Earth. Or watch some TED Talks, whatever. Like, there is a reckoning that as a species, like we can't have the necessary conversations. You can't have necessary conversations with your relatives about end of life until they've done some reckoning with, they've had that second shock of existence. They've let that hit them. You can't have a conversation as a species until we've reckoned with the reality that, like, this is where this leads. And we don't talk about it. We're not talking about it. Nobody's talking about it. We talk about the fear. We talk about, the state of the world. And like, we'll tell stories about it and the new bad thing that's happened. But that's not the same thing as a reckoning. We don't know how to talk to our kids about it. I don't have kids, but I see that in my friends that do have kids, and people in my family that have kids. And I'm not judging. I'm just saying that, like, that This is sense making. This is naming. There are things that are real that we're not talking about. What I would like to share in closing the name of this blog is The Other Side of Complexity. The name of this YouTube channel, the Substack associated with it. What I want to share is that like there's something that comes after each of these shocks of existence. And if it doesn't hit you the first time, you get I think there are aftershocks, let me just say. If you've been following this channel or you know me in real life, you know that in the last year I've been navigating the reality of having a hereditary aneurysm disorder. And I found out about a little over a year ago that I had 2 aneurysms, one on my heart that has since been repaired, and then one on my abdomen, in my abdomen, that I am 18 days from when I will have surgery to repair it. And because there are wait times for certain kinds of exams, I'm still waiting to learn whether I have aneurysms in my brain. And there's this beautiful state of being that I wish we could get to as a species, where there is sadness but not fear. It's like I have sadness about my health. I have sadness about the fact that I've had to step out of life for like a 3-month chunk of time for surgery and recovery back in April, and then I'm going to do it again in a couple of weeks. But like the shock removes the fear. Like once you have reckoned with it, you have sadness but no fear. And before you reckon with it, you don't even have sadness. You just have fear. And I think like sadness is not the permanent condition either. Like sadness is like, this is how I experience the pain of my personal health condition, is that, it comes in waves. These like waves of like a realization that like, oh, my life is not going to include something that just clicks to me in a moment, and then I'm a puddle. Then you get up. Mostly it's joyous. Like mostly when you don't have fear, you're happy and joyous. And I remember going through a series of papers and books reckoning with climate change specifically. And just like staring down the possibility, which felt like a certainty when I was looking through it. It's like, oh my God, it's going to be terrible. And and going through a lot of grief and crying about the state we were in as a planet. And same thing, like it still hits me. Like I have faced a lot of that and going out into the world and seeing like who is suffering and how they are getting by. I don't know what it's like in your city or where you are, but where I am, there's just a lot more like sadness on the streets and desperation on the streets than there was 8 years ago in this city. And it actually puts you more in play the more you're doing sense making, reckoning, and facing the reality of our situation. And I think it also, like, I don't know how one could vision without facing reality, without looking directly at what's happening, without naming what's actually possible right now. It's partly because you'd be creating a vision from a canvas that's not your real canvas. Like you'd be painting a vision on a canvas that's not like, doesn't have the right boundaries, doesn't have the right settings. But also because of the release that happens when you've actually faced reality, when you've like looked into the void, walked into the void, moved forward. And then you meet other people who are also doing the work, who are also like have faced it, have faced the fear of the future that isn't happening. It's not going to come. It's not going to happen. You get that sense once you're actually able to like grasp onto an alternative vision that is not a reaction to the status quo, but is a way that the status quo evolves. Because we are not changing the status quo. We're evolving the status quo. That is the only work that we get to do. We don't get to play God. We get to work with the cards that we were dealt. We get to work with the people who are at our card table, who are in our lives. We get to work with this set of circumstances and build a vision for the future. Not from a place of naivety about everything that's happening in the world, which it might look like to people who are still afraid, who still haven't looked in, because the fear does disappear. Absolutely, the fear disappears. Sadness sticks around. When there are sad things, you are not emotionally neutering yourself. When you do sense making, you are emotionally empowering yourself by strengthening your ability to feel, by strengthening your ability to engage with the reality of the world, by strengthening your ability to not look away when it gets uncomfortable. And that allows you to experience the full sadness of it, which is important data that we all need in order to make decisions about how to live in this world right now. If we're not taking that data in, we're doing ourselves and the people around us some degree of harm. That's what sadness offers us. And a release. And it's from that space that we can actually imagine and vision. And not just develop a more accurate story of the world, which is part of it. We have to learn how to tell an accurate story of the world, a complete story of the world, a story that doesn't exclude by virtue of what it values, a story that includes belonging for everyone. But we also realize at that point that, like, guys, we're the story. The story, like, we're living the story. It's like it's not changes in this time, this revolution, this one. It's like the only change that works is a revolution of the way we make sense that includes some degree of identification with the whole, a high degree of identification with the whole, a willingness to love the whole, a willingness to take responsibility for the whole, even the parts of it that are maybe hard to look at. That ability to see clearly and expansively. And to consciously hold intention. And to be aware of some of the, like, fundamental unchangeables of reality that aren't within our ability to control and dream up better ways of doing things. Like, that's why we do sense making. That's why sense making matters. We do it for the whole.